This is a open forum, and we're going to talk about the open letter to cause giant AI experiments, and it was published. It came out of a organization which feels that we need to be very cautious about AI. And this is, from my point of view, a way of figuring out what people are thinking about this. In any case, I'm not going to provide a great deal of early structure here, but if someone has an opinion, they're willing to open up the conversation, that would be it. I would suggest you unmute your microphone before talking.
I've been reading Bruce Schneier's newsletter, and he had two different articles on the risks here.
Mm-hmm.
Of this kind of thing.
He did not sign the open letter, by the
way. I didn't know that. But as I gather, his main point is the risk is that these things will be trained to manipulate the way people see certain events. That was one of the articles. The other one was on how it makes lobbying easier at scale. He pointed out the things that lobbyists do and how time-consuming that is, and how these tools can do the bulk of that work at scale. I mean, do thousands instead of one at a time to influence legislators. So that's my knowledge of the subject, and those seem like real risks.
Well, they may be real risks, but don't we do that already?
Well, we have lobbyists, but it might take, two lobbyists a month or more to influence a legislator in some way. And these tools can influence 100 legislators in a day. That's what he meant by at scale. The difference is the scale.
Isn't that the beauty of having a system, though, one which is automated and is efficient, and this isn't no different than anything that we do currently. It's just more efficient. It's
right.
Like having a car to go across the country.
Right. Right. But there are things that we are happy to see be inefficient, like retail theft. We don't want that to be 100 times easier.
Well, I'm not certain that if you're in the right place, that may not be that may not be a problem. There are communities where theft may be perfectly acceptable.
Well, my point is that there are things that we currently put up with because they're at a manageable scale. So we put up with lobbying. In fact, lobbying has great value, but we put up with it because it's at a manageable scale. But what if the influence was, 100 times more efficient? That might not be something that we would want to see. Mm-hmm. That's the point he's making. These things never occurred to me.
Uh-huh. Well, I mean, you're a technologist. Things that some of these non-technologist people, and Bruce is a technologist, by the way, I don't know.
Yeah, and then the other one is today, most of the misinformation is not tightly targeted to individuals. Whereas at the scale of these AI, they can, when they're giving me a response to a question, they can know a lot about me and target the response to me individually, and do that with every one of millions of people who are trying to learn about a given issue. And that's another risk.
Right. And that's a reason for not allowing it to be developed further.
Well, there. My understanding of the letter, which I didn't read, was that we have these risks and we don't know what to do about them. So let's slow down. Let's not make the next generation available until we have a handle on how to deal with the risks. That's my understanding of the intent of the letter.
That's the understanding of the intent letter. Did you look at looking at the list of signatures is definitely worthwhile.
Yeah.
And, you know, I have a fairly broad knowledge base of who's doing what where. And the vast majority of the 1,000 experts are retired emeritus professors and professors of some liberal arts field or something like that. They're not experts in artificial intelligence. There are people who were quite credible, but they were actually fairly few and far between in the population that signed the letter.
Yeah, I've been asked to sign these letters too, where I have no particular expertise, and I simply said no. But a lot of people would just sign on because it's like people who sign petitions, I guess. Without thinking deeply, it sounds reasonable, so they sign on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but there are some very serious thinkers on that list, and so it's worth thinking about, worth this discussion.
There were serious thinkers on that list. Very few of them.
It doesn't take a lot. 5 out of it. I don't care how many signed it. 1 million could have signed it, but if 5 serious thinkers think this is a problem, they're worth listening to.
Well, okay. At the risk of causing a bit of a schism here, do you believe that Elon is a serious thinker for this field?
I don't think he's a serious thinker about anything, but that's. He's been warning about this for longer than most people. This kind of thing. So
yeah. Well, the people that I have several friends who signed it. I'm not really sure that I think that most of the ones that I do know that signed it really are serious thinkers, or one of them said, well, he didn't really want to have to defend himself, but he was thinking about the problem, doing some research, and he wasn't ready to talk about it. And so he thought it was a good time for a little moratorium so he could get caught up.
That's a different motivation, it sounds like.
Well, it seemed in many cases that the reasons that people didn't want to sign on was that it was not to their advantage.
Yeah, that's true, but we have seen evidence of risks, and this goes back to the atom bomb. The first bomb, they said there was a 1 in 1,000 chance they'd ignite the atmosphere and end life on Earth. I would have said, wait, let's not take that chance. The penalty's quite high.
Well, yeah, but again, you have to really, when you evaluate positions people have, you have to sort of evaluate them in context. Right. And the people who thought that might ignite the atmosphere were a little crazy.
No, I don't think they were crazy. I've read about that. I know the physics behind it. It was deemed highly unlikely, but not impossible. There was no physics that meant it wouldn't happen. But again, at this point, I'm reading articles, newspaper level articles, not technical articles, on various risks. The 2 that Schneier pointed out. There's other risks in terms of what's it going to do to the job market that people are worried about. My son has a job that might be doable by one of these AI systems, and do we want to just dive in, or do we want to stop and think?
Well, of course, the people who forecast this sort of thing are as questionable as all the rest of them. But I just read an article which said that they thought that roughly 75 to 80% of all jobs could be replaced by AIs.
I don't buy that big a number because we don't have sufficient information yet. But in fact, I just had to do a stock transaction, and it was complicated. So I spoke to a representative there, and at the end I said, "Thank you. You're much more helpful than ChatGPT."
Well,
so
yes.
I think there'll still be a need for people. The question is, what will the transition look like?
You think that there's still a need for people? Yeah, I think you're right there. First of all, the thing that no one, the dirty little secret is that none of the various generative AI systems actually work. They sort of work, and they're extremely friendly. They will happily create articles supporting their case and footnotes, and make not only the article that you're asking it to make, but the footnote article that it references as well. And it creates them out of whole cloth, and whether they're true or not doesn't really much matter. But that's something that will probably get fixed.
Well, there's two problems that I see. When it first came out, I was concerned about my son's job. He writes articles for the Santa Clara University website about the athletic teams. So I asked ChatGPT to write an article about the most recent women's soccer game.
Mm-hmm.
And it wrote a very nice article. It's the kind of thing you'd see in any sports blog or anything like that. But it got the score wrong.
That's embarrassing.
Yeah, well, but the point is that it has no way of knowing truth. If there was a typo in in some announcement of the game, it treats that as correct, even though there's been a correction added later. It wouldn't have a way to know. So now is that fixable without having some broader context to evaluate quality of information?
The answer, I think, is yes. Actually, fairly easily, but that's a slight modification of the training mechanisms.
I don't know how slight, but yeah,
it's trying to fix it so it has a semi one-shot like thing.
Now I've been using it as a search engine, experimenting with it, and now I find that often I can get the answer faster from ChatGPT than I can from Google. And I'm asking questions about code, so I know right away if it's right or wrong. But yeah, so I let somebody else talk.
Yeah, I'm good.
I've said everything I know.
Well,
some that I don't.
I think to take off with on the beginning session of the quarter. But this
we get one person on one. Well, you're on one side, and I guess I'm on the other side.
You're in favor of doing a moratorium? I'm
in favor of slowing down. Not necessarily more. The research can go on, but releasing the newer systems to the public is the thing I think I might want to wait on, to see, have some evaluation of what the impact might be. Not that they shouldn't do the research. That's I have no problem with that. But just opening it up to the general public, we saw some really bad stuff with the first Bing one.
What was the bad stuff that you saw?
Well, the first one was the chat engine that people train, all of a sudden it was talking anti-Semitic and racist comments, and
Yeah.
it was awful. And they took that down right away. Then they recently made it part of Bing, and
They made the chatbot part of Bing, or the process?
yeah, and well, to do searches, and didn't work well. It had the hallucination problem. So I think these things are not well tested. Now, part of testing is opening them up, but maybe not to everybody, but to small communities to get them done. I see a note here that some of these people are physicists, and I have a physics background, and my answer is just because somebody is smart in one field doesn't mean they're smart in another one. So I'm taking those with a grain of salt. I want to know what their AI chops are before I put a special weight because a physicist signed this letter.
Well, I have a different view. I think that trying to control the experimentation here is going to cause problems. And I think also that the economic advantage of using this technology is so great that it's going to get used regardless of what sort of controls you put in.
Well, that's the OpenAI CEO. He says he's scared of it, but he's just going to plow ahead because it's just too economically valuable, and not just to his company, to the world. I mean, I'm finding myself I'm more efficient because of it.
Yeah. So do you believe that the output from the AIs is intellectual property? Is it a creative work?
So the I have a PhD in astronomy, and the American Astronomical Society just put out a note about using these systems to write your technical articles, and they do a damn good job. But they now say they must be listed as an author if they do.
Which means they can't be copyrighted.
Well, the articles are copyright.
No, they can't be.
Why?
Because the Copyright Office does not allow a artificial intelligence agent to be listed as an author at this point.
Oh, even if there are human authors as well?
Even if they're human authors.
Okay, well, the American Astronomical Journals are all open access now, so that may not be an issue for them.
I see. Well, it's sort of interesting how this works. The intellectual property, what's a creative act? What's a work of authorship? And what's derivative works? Because the way in which the AIs basically work is they decompose the observations they make about the entire world into very small pieces, and then they're interconnected in various ways, and then you effectively start out with a position in the universe, and you grow a complete whatever it is you're going for from that mud that has been created by the learning process. It's not clear that it's anything as a derivative work in the sense of copyright, but it's certainly based upon knowledge which is gained by the computer program observing other data.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's an extreme example of autocorrect when I'm typing in Microsoft Word, but it's not different. It changed the words that I wrote.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. So there must be a threshold then that the Copyright Office is using that I haven't heard articulated. So, by the way, there was an interesting point somebody made. The more times these things are used, the more of the generated text is out there on the internet that they're using to generate text.
Oh, yes.
So there sounds like there's an exponential feedback loop here.
Uh-huh. That is correct. And the other thing is that it's like there are papers. We had a paper earlier this year from a person who was talking about detecting the use of the AI in a document that was created, and could it be detected, and could you differentiate? Well, of course, if you can't differentiate, then it becomes very difficult to say, well, you can copyright these things, but you can't copyright those things.
Yeah, yeah.
But the other thing is, any process which uses learned information to accomplish a particular task then becomes questionable.
Well, that's autocorrect.
Yeah, or
Is autocorrect questionable?
it certainly is. And in fact, in a very real sense, ChatGPT is sort of an extension of but it's an extension of the suggestions that now are presented as you type ahead.
Right. Yeah. I want to respond to B's comment here. I'm not in favor of pausing research, commercial and academic research. I'm thinking about the benefits of pausing the commercialization, the opening up of it to the general use. I think that's more what I think we should be doing, rather than pausing the research. I think the research should go on because that will give us the information to know what the effects will be. I have no problem with that, but opening it up to the general public at a time when it's uncertain what the implications would be is like, opening up certain biological research that we think would be beneficial long-term, but might have harmful effects that we want to be able to understand first.
Well, the problem is that when you separate and get people who get to use it and people who don't into two different groups, that gives one group power over the other. And
well, it depends on,
that's a good sign.
It depends on the restrictions you put on how they use it.
And who's going to enforce it?
The controller of it. We've done this forever in software testing. We've always given it out to small groups and told them, here's how you can use it and here's how you can't. So, for example, in your company, you may not make it available to everybody. We're testing it with this set of 5 people. And if you violate that, you violated the contract. We do that all the time.
Right. But that's primarily, the law that's used for that is primarily a non-disclosure law. That's a contract.
Yeah, and that's a reason, not an unreasonable. And in fact, the newest one is these things are always rolled out to small groups first. That's the way these have been done. Opening up ChatGPT 3, that was a big deal, but 4 was used by modest size audiences for months. And what they're saying now is let's do 5, finish it, get it out there, but to small audiences, not to the general public. And I think that's not unreasonable.
Well, okay.
But I'm not in favor of slowing the research. I think the research has to go on because that's how we're going to know the best and the worst of it.
Okay, but who does the research? That's my question.
Whoever gets the funding.
If I self-fund, do I get to do research on anything I want?
Well, up to your funding, depends on your proposal.
Proposal to whom?
Sorry, go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Sorry, I was late a little. I was thinking about this thing previously, and the concept of AI winter. So here, I think it would be good to draw comparison maybe with gene editing technology, which is also considered quite powerful, and there are specific regulations in place that may help to actually regulate the process because it is considered to be helpful. But due to the fact that not all about this known, what genes are responsible for specific functions, it can cause certain issues. And I think here it also, we may not know the social consequences of this technology further in the long run. So I think the proposition to slow it down I find it in a certain extent beneficial. So of course it requires a lot of evaluation how to actually do this, but it would help to put actually regulations in place to balance this quite rapid progress with the benefits and actually drawbacks that also exist with it. So it is quite clear that it's mostly done by private companies. And this is why the slowing the process, so not absolutely stopping, which also there's a question about this. So the slowing down may benefit in production of these regulations to make it actually safe and sustainable in the long run, because there are still many questions that it raises, especially such powerful updates that currently going on. And I think it would help, but there are more discussion how actually it can help, and more analysis I think is required.
Yeah, I have a friend who wrote a science fiction novel about CRISPR technology run amok and being stolen by evil people, this might fall into that, or the virus research and pathogen research. But again, you said to slow down the research. I don't mind the research. What scares me is the general availability, where anybody can get their hands on the most powerful current research prototypes, and that's the part that worries me. I have less trouble with the research proceeding because I think we will learn what the good parts are as well, and maybe how to control the bad effects by the research. And slowing the research might affect both the good and the bad. But it's the deployment that has me a bit worried.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I absolutely agree. So maybe the term research wasn't exactly the one I was thinking about. So the implementation then, because research indeed it provides this also analysis of the situation. So it would maybe also depend the direction of research. So how it, whether it goes further into practice and how it goes into practice. So because making the AI winter actually can have negative consequences for the maybe system functions also, and the possible drawbacks that it brings. So it also questions whether it is possible and whether it is safe at all to have it. So can we actually maybe lose control over the further progress in this area? So it also requires more evaluation, because I haven't seen too many papers on the AI winter and how it will have a social consequence, or what actually this evaluation of the situation would happen. And maybe in general, what some of the fears in here, the losing control, maybe it would be also beneficial to have this kind of more control in the sense that we regulate the technology by regions, because currently it's implemented worldwide, and it is also quite complicated in a sense by private companies, and in how it also draws on data from Europe. And there was an idea to have this kind of established offices or certain teams that cooperate and actually help to bring the changes like ethical regulations into place. So actually implementing this, work on the implementation that would help to develop more sustainable AI and technology that is based on AI.
Yeah. I participate a bit in the Foresight Institute, and they have people worried about AGI, artificial general intelligence. And that's a even farther out than the things that this is about. But the sense I get from what little I've read of their stuff is I think it's a positive thing, that AGI will have a positive rather than a negative influence. So the AI winter, the AGI winter, they think it will be expanding human capacity, and they're working on ways to make that happen. So if you're interested, you might connect to the Foresight Institute and see what they're doing. I'm just a hanger-on. I tell them that they think about much more important things than what I worry about.
I'm not certain that's true.
I'm the nitty bitty bits and bytes and down in the dust kind of guy, and they're up in space. So
you're not worried about the asteroid that's coming to collide with the Earth?
Yeah, that's pretty practical though. But yeah. So,
but yeah, about AGI, it's like there's still big question whether it is at all possible, since currently we're quite far from that level, in my opinion, at least. Well, there are different opinions, different visions of this.
Well, they're thinking 20 to 100 years ahead.
Like I read about 20 years, but I think it's still early, quite early, because to actually cause a state of mind, you need something quite as strong as brain. And we still don't understand brain. So a mere program cannot cause mind, which not many people understand.
Yeah, no, they're one of the things they wrote is this group that they wrote a book, and one of the chapters in the book is mining asteroids and distributing the wealth evenly across the entire population. I mean, these people are really out there. So, but again, their view is that AGI will be disruptive, but overall, like any new technology, there's a period of disruption, and at the end, the world is better off. And that's my impression of their view. And they're trying to work to make sure that happens, that it doesn't become a problem. And so that's the kind of thing they're working on. One issue I have with AGI, I read a book by Steven Pinker about the brain. And he asked the question, why would a robot choose to do anything? He said, why do we choose to do anything? And this was a whole chapter in the book. And the point was, his view was, we choose to do things because of emotion. And if robots don't have emotion, they would never do anything except, plug themselves in to make sure they don't die. But why would they do anything? So it would be the humans asking them to do things that set their goals, not the robots themselves. I mean, I finally figured out why I do what I do, and I'm still trying to impress my father. I'm in my 70s, and I'm still trying to impress my father. So,
is your father impressed duly?
He was. When I started.
Now it's even harder to impress him.
Now it's even harder. Well, I don't know. Maybe it isn't. I don't know.
I see.
When I started studying physics, he was duly impressed. So.
Okay.
Good job. I wanted to add maybe to the idea of AGI and generally kind of, because I view this also from the perspective of regulations and ethical implementation and practice. So I think the issues that I read about and actually also saw the certain actions that were taken is that some focus on the AGI so much that they actually miss the current issues and challenges, like both ethical, moral, and others that we face today. So, for example, the discrimination, which is one of the biggest issues, and the data. So that also can be biased in different ways. So which already exists today, because as we know, like these biases get automated and spread on a mass scale, which definitely is a complex issue. So another thing is that maybe I understand why you maybe hang around them, because it's indeed interesting to know like what actually the idea, so what the concept there might be and how they see to do this. Yet I think it's also currently the focus is should be more on the nearest term consequences, because when we look too far, we just lose our goal actually of solving what we have now.
So what's your background? What are you doing that this is interesting to you?
I do philosophy of technology, so particularly is ethics of artificial intelligence and ethics of data, but more of AI, so algorithmic ethics as well.
Where are you?
In Poland, University of Białystok. So yeah.
Okay.
And I'm writing thesis on this topic, and yeah, so about policy making and social impact. So I think this is my angle partially here. But
you should definitely contact the Foresight Institute. They actually have Foresight Fellows that they fund to do the kind of work you're doing.
Yeah, I think I actually read about it. Maybe I even took online course. Was it? I don't remember. Was it Foresight or the Institute of Future? I just was curious about futurism. So futurism.
There's a lot of overlap between those two. But yeah, Foresight Institute might be interested in funding the work you're doing, because it seems to be quite close to what they're interested in.
We'll have an opportunity, I think, perhaps later this month for you, Zoya, to meet some of the Foresight people.
Thank you. Yeah, I will look into this. So I'm just really think that the regulations or certain steps or a code of ethical conduct is really necessary in artificial intelligence, especially now because it's so fast going. So when I saw the proposal to actually pause the progress that taken place in the practice, so to like slow down the experiments, I found it wasn't like a big surprise to me, and I do see a reason. So maybe it would be necessary, because some are also worried, for example, in AI-powered warfare, that they will fall back. But I think that building a more sustainable system in the long run is more important than having short-term benefits, because it will be beneficial both for the country, for people, and for society as a whole. So I think it shouldn't, like some worry that regulations as well as such a pause can actually hinder the progress. But it is maybe true in the short term, but the long term it will have good benefits. Plus, people will trust in a regulated and well-built technology, rather than they will be always worried and do not feel safe to actually cooperate. So I think it's also important as a human element, so that we trust it. So trustworthy AI or explainable AI, like trustworthy AI is a concept more in European Commission that they focus on, but explainable AI is more maybe popular, so that we actually can understand the decision and how technology works. So open up the black box.
Well, have you know how these things work? Because I know a lot about the guts of the inside. I've done a lot of work on the numerical methods that they use inside of these things. I've never done the AI itself, but I've developed the algorithms that they use inside of them. And explainable AI is going to be really tough.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think maybe we should focus some more research on that, but I don't know how it's going to happen.
I think you can make a fairly good case for explainable AI being an impossible case.
Well, again, in Pinker's book, one of his conclusions was that in order to understand our human brain, we need something more than a human brain. And in order to understand our AI systems, we need something more than the AI systems. And so,
Well,
yeah.
I don't think that it can't be done argument needs all that much support because of the fact that it's basically a probabilistic argument that the number of possibilities which need to be explored in order to work the problem backwards is outrageously high.
Physicists have a saying, if something isn't forbidden, it will happen. And every prominent physicist that's ever said that's impossible has been proven wrong. Unless
say that again.
Unless it was forbidden by, I mean, you can't have a perpetual motion machine. Okay, that's forbidden by the physics. But everything that's allowed by the physics event does happen. And,
oh yeah, that's David Deutsch's new formulation of physics.
Yeah. So to say that we will never be able to explain the AI, I expect that something of the complexity of ChatGPT will be able to explain the decisions of a very small AI system, 100 neuron system. I think that's entirely possible. We don't know how to do it yet, but I think it's entirely possible. But will the largest AI systems be able to explain themselves? That I have doubts.
Okay. I guess I disagree with you. I don't think even 100 neuron system can be explained because most of the information is not in the neurons, but rather in the data that the neurons processing.
Yeah.
And it's generative in the sense that everything has been decomposed into very small pieces, and your choice of what exactly is there is partially probabilistic, and the number of possibilities gets to be very, very large very quickly.
Yeah. So
yeah, there's also, I understand that it's complicated, and currently there were like tries to do like Lime and SHAP systems, or more like models for explanation, so local interpretable model, agnostic explanations, and SHAP-related explanations. Those do have drawbacks, but I think it just shows that there is a step toward explanation. And like it was mentioned, maybe it is possible a part. So we start with this part, but later we can maybe explain already the whole system. So again, as also Dennis mentioned, it's mostly in the data. And there was like a concept, actually, it was more like an idea that we should maybe look to aviation field, so sphere of activities, because it is heavily regulated, and also in a sense that it, for example, has such thing as their black box, or a different one. So the one that record actually actions of a plane to actually look into how certain events unfold. So maybe in this sense, so it would be good to have explainable AI by design, but actually takes a lot of effort. So, and rebuilding AI into explainable way, it's maybe even more complicated, but the main goal is that human can understand and explain the decisions. So maybe we do not have to see all the details, all the minor elements that took place, but we need to get a good idea of what happened, why it happened, and explain to the people, for example, since AI is also used in the social world, for example, for credit scoring, right? To get a loan that's already implemented, hiring mechanisms for job placements, as well as court systems that are also already enforced. So I think it's good to even start with a little, but I also believe that it is possible to actually explain AI fully later on. So it does take time. It's not so easy. It also took time to build AI. So to explain it, it will also take some time, but step by step, I think it's possible. So that especially if you build explainable AI by design, so the explainability systems already in place before the product is already. So it would be much easier than explaining the already ready one. So there are also ways around it. So I have studied from more social technical perspective, but I also looked into the details and I actually found a really nice presentation on that topic. It was a group of scientists. It was a conference, also accompanied by the paper, by their small presentation of their topic. And I got the impression that actually there is already going quite good, I would say. There are possibilities to actually make it now, but it is still early and complicated. This is here once again by pause may come beneficial to actually more work on this side of explainability and how to keep it controlled. So how to actually keep it stable. And maybe while we keep the experiment, we work on this more like safe food. So we know what's happening. And
You said something very interesting, that perhaps the answer to explainable AI is to design it from the beginning to be explainable. That we're unable, as Dennis said, we can't even explain simple AI system, neural net systems today, but maybe some other technology other than neural net, maybe separately or in parallel with the neural net. But it has to be designed together. We have plenty of examples of things that are impossible if they're designed separately, and relatively straightforward if we design them together. Now, I don't know the research, so I don't know if anybody is doing that. The talks I've heard on explainable AI don't sound too promising to me.
But I was going to say that decision trees possibly combined with statistical methods seem like sort of that sort of approach.
I also mentioned your comment. I was just about to address it. I think the decision tree would be nice, but it doesn't account for uncertainty. So this is what AI generally also nowadays deals with. So this uncertainty aspect. And because decision tree is closer to previous types of AI that were used. So it may be, it is good for an explanation, but it may be quite complicated with the current because they don't use as much decision trees anymore. But it definitely could work like that. But yeah, since the neural network is so complicated and the black box, it would be more aiming at opening this black box. So what's happening, or at least getting an idea how it reached certain conclusion due to all the data and uncertainty that it came into contact with.
By the way, in the early days of AI, there were knowledge engineers. There were people who could do amazing things. And when you asked them how they did it, they couldn't explain it. One project we had, I was working for IBM at the time, and this was in the late 80s. There were people who could schedule oil tankers and optimize their trips. And they were all getting into their 50s and 60s and getting close to retirement. And so they sent out people to ask them how they did it. And they could not articulate how they did it. So there were people at Stanford, I can't remember the professor who was leading the effort, but they developed a discipline for extracting from them how they solve these very hard problems. And perhaps that's something that we could use with these AI systems to learn how they reached a certain decision. So maybe that's an area of research that hadn't occurred to me before, but we had to do it with humans. Humans were solving very complex problems and couldn't explain how. And AI is solving very complex problems and can't explain how. So maybe we need this discipline of knowledge engineering applied to the AI. I'm going to have to go. It's nice to meet you, Zoya. And I hope I'll run into you at a Foresight event, maybe. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay. any case, you used the CRISPR stuff as an example, and it is a good example because there is a fairly substantial community of people doing experimentation with genetic modification on their kitchen table. There's a store in Oakland, California, run by Hosea Zentner called The Odin. And there they sell all of the equipment necessary, including kits, to experiment with modification of genetic material, particularly human genetic material. And so if you want to experiment with yourself and modify your genetic structure, you can do so with some of their kits. You can do it locally or you can do it globally. You can change the color of the materials produced by E. coli bacteria from brown to red to green and things like that. And you can have experimentation of modifying and doing genetics. I don't believe the mythical kit for glow-in-the-dark bunnies is available yet, but there's quite an amazing change in what goes on. Likewise, people build semiconductors at home now too. And so making computers is not necessarily only the purview of a large company. Could be a small company or something you do in your back garage. And I think my concern about regulating AI is the same I have with any regulation of knowledge. It's not possible. It doesn't work. It never works. It always leaks out. We even probably the closest held secrets that we have are how to build nuclear weapons. And it used to be that only a small number of people knew that. And now that number continues to grow larger and larger. Still not very large. That's been remarkably good. And in the days when the first of the massive weaponry was developed in the 11th century, when the crossbow was first brought out as a weapon of war, there was a general agreement that it was too terrible to use, and that didn't last long.
But at the same time, it may not actually prohibit everybody, because as we know, some scientists do make gene-edited projects, especially the recent one when I think kids were gene-edited to be protected from HIV, finally. So, but still, I think what I hear is, yes, we cannot regulate those individuals to the end, but how many actually cases it could have already prevented, making it legal? So how many actually experiments on humans were prevented by this regulation? Because some are very eager, but understand they would have to carry responsibility. So unless you're very certain, like that scientist was, which also still really affected badly the community, even the creator of CRISPR, she was deeply surprised and wasn't ready for this as well. So, because what the comparison here is the power of the technology. Both are very powerful. And again, AI is not as regulated, but for example, aviation, it also relates to society. It's also powerful. It carries people. Yes, it's transportation, but still it has levels of certification. It has levels of training. So that would help. So I think certification is what is actually lacking and needed in AI, since certification would also ensure that the person who uses AI know about not only technical elements, how to build AI well, it would also know about ethical consequences and social impacts, because now their technology may have an impact and they're like, oh, I didn't know, I wasn't aware. And end of the story, they can't be really prosecuted. So, or just brought the responsibility onto it. And AI is also complicated because it has many actors. So one is made this technology, another one trained, another one maybe distributed. So who's responsible? It's like the famous question: if Tesla car, it's pedestrian, who's responsible? Tesla, or maybe those who feed data, or maybe the driver. Maybe the driver did something. So it takes time to actually understand allocation of responsibility. It's also a big, generally it's a big question in machine ethics. So who is responsible for what? And in general, it's a question regarding the human society, because also the responsible is not always to blame, but the one to blame is responsible. So there is also differences in this. But yeah, I stand for certifications. That's definitely, because it is, I think, very unregulated right now.
Mm.
And it just not so safe. And gene editing, in that sense, also shows this how that area is regulated and how it had helped. Because again, we do not know all the long-term consequences how AI will impact society, considering what we see already now. And the same for genes. You can edit a gene that you may know responsible for something, but the issue with genes is that it may be responsible for more than one thing, and more than two, and more than three. So if there is big questions how the gene is connected to the rest of the system, how AI is connected to the rest of the system, how it impacts society. Because generally AI reflects our biases and our current issues, because it used our data, which it feeds on, and then later, plus the ideas of the developers or trainers, and then it gets multiplied. So
I
yes.
think I agree very much with your basic thrust here, which is that people need to know more about what's going on and how it works. And I have always been a strong believer that people don't learn enough science, and they don't learn enough mathematics, and they don't learn enough history and enough ethics and so forth to actually live in the world that they live in. It's, people are grossly undereducated. And, we're particularly lucky here in the sense that we're surrounded by a group of people who have had the opportunity to think and talk about many of these issues, but a lot of people don't ever reach that level, and it's a big problem.
Yeah, it is true indeed an issue, and I was thinking about this as well. So I thought actually to maybe make a certain AI literacy program that would maybe even on the side of a user to start with, because this is where the most consequences happen and go to the top. Because regulation take long time. Like even with GDPR, it took like 4 years, I think, to actually come into effect. So it was accepted on, I think it was 2016, no, maybe 2 years to come into effect, plus the earlier development, the proposals, the decisions. So about 4 years altogether. So it was accepted in 2016 and came into effect in 2018. And this considered to be quick. It's considered to be quite fast. So the regulation world is lagging behind. It's too slow. So again, this is where the POS may come handy. But it's also like big question how this POS is implemented, how it's done, what are the consequences, because it's mostly private companies that do that. So even since we live in a quite capitalist era, and those companies, I think, have quite capitalistic approach. So on financial gains, it's question how we actually can convince them to make POS. But here is that my point about literacy was that we have digital literacy that was also quite an issue when computers started to be available worldwide. So some governments actually had a literacy program like Estonia. So in that sense, they had actually literacy programs. So that's why it's actually, I think, the only digital government here. So you can vote online. Like you can do anything online, so it's very comfortable. And I think you can't divorce online and marry. That's what you can do. The rest you can do online, except maybe some minor things when you need to actually bring the physical document. So yes, and they had this literacy program on digital literacy, so how to use computers. So of course it's not perfect, and I see some other things that they are not aware about, but they have this basic skill for sure. They know how to use emails, they know how to enter a system. That's normal to them. So that may belong to other people in some other countries of the same age that some struggle with this. And so the point that maybe we need same for AI, or generally how to use digital, more advanced technologies. So not only AI, but other algorithmic system, and maybe some social media for younger people, maybe also for older people too. So how to interact in social media, because it also relies on algorithms, so it also related to the topic. So maybe some kind of these programs to actually explain what is going on. And maybe also try to reach the developers, promote ethics, because I recently read quite nice paper from Rai, Nitesh Rai. I think he is a master student or already graduated. And the paper proposed like this kind of teams, transdisciplinary teams that will help to actually navigate an AI and regulate and actually make sure that ethical concepts are used, implemented. Because one thing is to think about ethics, another thing is to implement ethics. So there is, this is one of the big challenges in this chain of reaching ethical AI.
So do you believe that there's some absolute definition of ethics? An ethical act is definable how?
So I think there is no, because we can even formulate concretely like what is ethics and all the ethical principles. Here is the issue why we can't just put ethics into machine and machine like do ethics on its own. Or morality. How do we explain morality? What is it to be moral, or some moral principles? So what's here, the idea is more like, so the known concept of ethics, so more like general, that we can explain, for example, the anti-discrimination concepts or how to place them. This is something we can elaborate, but the absolute idea of ethics, I think human cannot elaborate. Like group of humans, all humans, I think, it come together. So many thinkers, and it's a big issue, like concept and philosophy. So what is ethics? It's been for so many years. It's thousands of years, like what is ethical, what is moral. So question of morality was a little longer. And yeah, so this, I don't know, absolute definition of ethics. We don't have even a definition of artificial intelligence fully formulated, which we also need for the policies. So how actually we define the AI, the only way, like, or certain way that is accepted on a regulation level. So
there's a joke about that, you know.
Yeah. And
artificial intelligence is it's something which is neither artificial nor intelligent.
Yes. So then it avoids the description by the name, because it kind of slightly still different. So how we define it, how do we include all its aspects, because it's both its study and a technology. So it's not only just the machine or the algorithm in the machine. It's actually a study of human mind. So this is how it started. It was like, I mean, before the Dartmouth conference, there was another one. It was like about how machine can help study human mind. And then there was Dartmouth, and then it's already went into a different direction of actually simulating or replicating, if possible, and giving a task. But through AI, it was the idea that we study human mind. A little got detached from that. Maybe we'll come back to that later. But like that. So
So I had one comment regarding ethics. I mean, there was a recent ACM Communications article sort of pointing this out, that ethics usually applies to humans. You know, we can say whether humans are acting ethically or not, and they usually, may make decisions that are somehow programmed into machinery, or build software or hardware that does a certain thing. But it's hard to judge, whether the software is ethical, but you can certainly look at whether the actions of the designers and the companies and everyone else. And I think Zoya brought up this really interesting counterexample of looking at social media, where it was just sort of rolled out as this massive experiment on humanity without regard for the consequences. And so perhaps that's an interesting comparison point to, I guess, what's driving at that it's the sort of commercial rollout and impact on society that perhaps you should think about.
Certainly true.
Mhm.
But, then the question is, we don't do that with anything else. And so I'm not certain that we ought to do it with just these few things that we do: social media and artificial intelligence and so forth.
You mentioned, gene editing and the interesting question is, are there certain technologies that have, huge risks that maybe we shouldn't give them out to everybody and they should be restricted, like how to build nuclear weapons? Is AI in the same category? It certainly seems like we are in an AI arms race. Do we want to distribute those weapons to everybody at their desktop right now? I don't know, maybe.
I think we have. And
Yes.
the fact is that even if we hadn't, it will be out there next week, because once you find out that it's possible, people think of different ways to do the same thing. And Facebook,
so maybe that's it's too late argument. Sorry, what?
Facebook has plugins, and for ChatGPT, and everybody is writing their program to use ChatGPT or GPT-3 or 2 or 1 or 4 or one of the other system. And in actual fact, these systems are pretty simple. They're not as complicated as we want to think they are. They're actually pretty straightforward. The data they operate on, however, is not, and it requires fairly large investment of effort to acquire the databases that are used. And those databases may or may not be publicly available. And if they're not publicly available, then I think we have a real problem. And if they are, then everybody has access to some extent. So it's a complicated problem, but it's one of our own making.
Yeah, it's definitely true. And it's also, this is why the regulation is necessary, like in gene editing, because it's not as complicated actually to do gene editing. Like, you need a certain equipment, that's true, that's not widely available, but still
I can do it. I can go down to the local drugstore and get all the stuff I need.
There are many DIY laboratories that actually do that. So here's also the question. So if it would be legal, then it would be many issues with this. But AI, there's also idea of AI terrorism.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because again, data, you can gather it from social media, but regarding, or maybe just the internet, right? Or maybe some companies sell it. So this is where we get the data. And the AI, you can build it, like if you're computer maybe science student and you had some practical classes, it's possible.
I think you're right. And in actual fact, what's interesting is that there's a major advantage to be had economically and also socially to be heavily into AI. So people are claiming that their system is an AI system, even when it's not. So we have that happening now. We have people using AI systems as as they were designed to be, and using them as just as a tool. And that works pretty well. We have people using it to create scams and other bad uses, and it's extremely effective for that. We're having stories created all over everywhere about things that people wish were true. And so we have an explosion of apparent creativity, which may or may not be a good thing. But there's a lot more activity and a lot more invention going on now with the advantage of having a machine to do the work than we did before. Whether that's a good or a bad thing is hard to tell, but it's certainly not something we wanted to have disappear, I think. And I don't think controlling it, particularly the people who would want to do the controlling, are probably not the right ones to do it, even if that were the case. Your government regulators, for example, generally say no to everything at the beginning because, well, it's safe.
Yes.
And I'm not certain that that's ideal for everybody or even anybody.
Mhm. So there is this also concept in policy making, that indeed most policies is like, don't do this, don't do that, it's not allowed, it's not allowed. But there are different ways actually how to regulate something. So there is also more like not always some legal enforcement. It can be like, again, code of conduct, which also can be binding legally. It also can be more like a recommendation that if you don't do this, like you, for example, lacks corporate social responsibility, right? That's so important. That like if you do this, it's unethical conduct, which also kind of has still effort because people won't choose, for example, if it's especially public something. And about also social media scandals, like that also be mentioned, like also the case with Cambridge Analytica, very famous. So that it used and analyzed profiles of so many users. So here's this social media experiment, so that they were actually allowed to do this and later sell this information. And yes, and even the point of manipulation, so people can get manipulated, especially vulnerable groups, because a use of internet usually implies that you're a healthy adult, but there are many kids on the internet. There are many vulnerable people who don't have full mental capacities, for example. So it's also, the world is quite diverse and different rather than, I don't know, only one perfect ideal concept of human who uses internet is present. So yes, this is why it may not fully actually offer this 100% protection, but it would definitely reduce the risks and harm if we start to actually certify developers or trainers. So there could be different categories of certification. So the question of certification, I found it already like twice. It's not so popular. So many regulations actually are more like do good, or more no, do not discriminate, reduce bias. So in make groups diverse, so human dignity and etc. But the thing with policymaking that I start talking about is that we should also, the issue that it's not only what people and developers have to work on, it's also policymakers. Because before it maybe was so easy to say, don't do this, end of the story. So don't kill. It's very bad. But here it's more like you have to, with this technology, explain how, why, and actually like the ways to do this, so offer approaches. So maybe the law and the regulation to say don't do that, or in certain way like explain the situation that may not be allowed, but later either supplemental documents can aid in actually how to reach this ethical level that is required, or maybe also in the regulation itself. For example, like the sustainable developments, we also have certain regulations that kind of limit the CO, for example, production. And also there are quite many documents that actually would help business or a certain corporation to actually reduce the steps how to achieve lower CO2 emission. So because it's also important for policymakers to actually explain if they want people to follow, especially with such technology that is space, right? It also quite available. It's not prohibited. So currently it also requires like certain ways how to do this. And yeah, but the biggest worry is the time in between we actually reach ethical and moral machine and from now. So what happens in between, whether there will be some related disasters, and when do we reach this ethical or more ethical technology?
Now, ethics and morals tend to be frameworks of belief, and they don't seem to have any intrinsic or intrinsic importance in the way in which the actual presence and being of things are. That is to say, you can be a moral person or not, and still live a perfectly ordinary life, or ethical life, or such. And so it's not a separable thing, and it's not really a property of the physics of things. It's more of a property of our belief structure. And that's part of the problem. One of the things that is really intrigued me, which led me to my belief that the singularity slipped in not too long ago, is that about a year ago, everyone who was doing research in AI, I know, started studying ethics. Now, the question is, why would they do that? And they're probably trying to figure out what their systems are doing and whether that's an ethical thing or not. The chatbot we were talking about, the one that learned how to be anti-Semitic and so forth, it had nothing to do with AI, had nothing to do with the data that was there, had to do with the data that got put there and created by the people who fed information and examples to it. So it's really a reflection of our society, and has nothing at all to do with AI. At least that would be my argument.
Definitely. So this is one of the points that I actually tried to explain with the idea of ethics and what it includes, why it's unethical, because it reflects society, and the issues that we have, again, get automated and distributed on mass scale. Yes, so we can limit a person. We can't limit AI, for example, on social media, because it has certain embedded ideas of the developers or data it has. And also recently I read quite interesting idea that maybe it is also necessary to prosecute people. I mean, there may be different ways how to do this and the degrees, but prosecute people who actually train AI with malicious intent to harm society. That would be interesting, I think.
That's very dangerous thinking, actually.
Because
I wanted to follow up on that. I mean, there is this a couple interesting things. One is that going back to like ACM, they've drafted this what I think is in many ways a pretty good ethics policy, which would seem to forbid a lot of activity performed by various companies like Facebook. Yet they've been rather reluctant to actually punish or discipline any to sort of enforce their policy. But it's possible they might in the future, which would be interesting. So there's this possibility that professional organizations could institute ethical frameworks and possibly decide to enforce them, although they haven't in the past in computing, but they might. And then there's this other idea, where the software and really I'd say the software industry especially has completely dodged any concept of liability. But of course, once software is in a self-driving car and the car hits someone, there's clearly liability issues. So as you mentioned, like sorting out those liability issues may clarify the legal regime. And then going back to, you mentioned Cambridge Analytica, there are sort of well-known sort of standards for kind of human subjects research, right, that were violated in that case. And that's sort of another angle that possibly those could be applied as well.
Actually, I believe in Cambridge Analytics, there was a release that was a couple of layers back that everyone signed that could, if you close your eyes and sort of pinch your nose, you could probably say it allowed the information to be gathered, but not shared. And then it was shared.
I mean, yeah, there are a lot of sort of questionable things. One is, the legality of these click-through agreements that nobody can figure out, or they perhaps don't understand, or perhaps legally can't consent to because they're not bound by the contract or something. And then there's also this idea of like, well, did the IRB appropriately at Cambridge or wherever appropriately approve this study? And then there's the question of, did they actually violate, even if the contract was valid, did they violate it, right? Yeah. I don't remember the specifics, but.
Well, there's I don't know, several years ago, I had a speaker who was extremely difficult to convince that she ought to come and talk about the case law, of which there is a substantial amount, that says that you don't have to do a click through at all. You just have to visit the site. And you're automatically co-opted into the regulations that relate to the site that are posted somewhere on the site, but without having guaranteed that you read them and were aware of them. And by the way, reading and being aware of a document doesn't really constitute agreement or understanding either. So, I mean, there's a whole lot of real issues about understanding and belief and models that you have about how to operate within the universe that are sort of left very much open. And it's like copyright on the internet now. If you put something on the internet, you give up copyright or not? Well, you don't, but you do sort of, because there's fair use and things like that. Fair use is an interesting concept, a very difficult concept.
This is why, again, we come back to the idea that AI actually reflects all these things. So this can come together because, again, we talk about simulated intelligence. So, and these all things like breach of contract is, it's not AI specific, but it also is an AI. So the things like not following ethical norms, well, it's common. I mean, I hope not. But it is present, so it is also everywhere else. So we should not forget that some issues are actually human, existed for quite a long time, and even some technical aspects. So they may be related to actually the information and communicational technologies ethics. So the communication ethics rather than AI specific thing. So just comprised of many different elements that come together and do have an impact when seen as one whole. So I think there are ways still to involve ethical, actually implement the ethical principles that we was talking about earlier. So that not all companies follow it, true, but there are still companies that do. And I mean, actually this limit the issue. So of course, can we ever reach 100%? Can we ever have something perfect? So I doubt it, but we can be close to perfection. We'll be close to the more healthy society. So I think it's also good.
I think we can certainly improve things.
Yeah, we can definitely improve. So even if it's not something like final destination that we're looking for, still the enhancements, they do bring value. And AI is useful. It does many great things. It just the drawbacks are quite significant. And this is just a short term because AI was possible to actually build quite recently. So it's not that old technology. So it was thought longer before, but it wasn't possible to make. So there is also important to keep that in mind. So the actual societal effects are quite fresh in the sense. So what happens in the long term? And about social experiments that Bea also mentioned is that these social networks, they actually manipulate feeds in the without consent, as I understand, of users to do their own experiments. Like Facebook did, it used like 600,000 users, and it actually manipulated their feed. So for some, it made more negative posts, and for others more positive. And look what happened. And then they analyzed their posting history, and these users who saw more negative news, more negative information, they started posting for negative information. Same was for the positive one. So it's like having manipulation, and so how it can actually impact, because some may not even mention, but we actually already quite used to our phones, and we look into this, and it's called like hand machine. So it's always in our hands and always nearby. We always wear it on ourselves. Some even feel like safe when phone is with them. So it really got embedded in our everyday life. So this is why it's also important to kind of regulate it for safe use. And so I think, yeah, there was some other point. LinkedIn, I remembered another example. LinkedIn also made their own experiment. So they provided for some users more opportunities, like more jobs opening and such, while less for others. And so what happened? Job is such a like important aspect in the lives of humans. So somebody was left with less opportunities for the sake of experiment. And as you remember, there was no consent involved. So here is also comes into play what these companies can do without the regulation. So they're not ethically bound to actually explain. So we do need ethics, at least on the more public level. So because public can also have the power to reinforce such things like we have with ecology. So of course it may be a bit different type of example, as it's still important to understand how different policies work in ecology and AI, or would work, because there are its own challenges, but I think so it would still be possible.
I think that's exactly correct. I think we need to call it an end today. Thank you very much. It's marvelous chatting with you as always. It turned out that we ended up with a three-way conversation. It would be thank him for his contribution and for the others and for earlier on. But I think it was just it's a good conversation. We're going to snip out this our little piece here, and it will be on the web, and it will be very nice. Thank you very much.
Okay, great.